I study ethics, which most of you probably have a pretty good sense of, at least in the broad strokes. Ethics is among the oldest and to this day among the largest branches of philosophy. It goes back to the very beginning of Western intellectual history. But unlike what you might think, I'm less concerned, at least on an intellectual level, with making judgments about what actions are right or what people are evil or what kinds of traits are virtuous and that sort of thing. I'm much more concerned with how we come to moral knowledge, what kinds of evidence count towards our moral beliefs and ought to count towards our moral beliefs. It's a field called moral epistemology, which is just a very technical word for how we know about right and wrong. And very specifically, my work is focused on intuitions, moral intuitions. There's a lot of type of intuition out there. And when I say moral intuition, what I mean is those sort of gut feelings, the very first sentiments that come to you when you encounter some kind of maybe a new moral situation or some act that you maybe doesn't sit right with you, or something in the news that gives you a particular kind of moral reaction. It's not a belief. It's something more basic, more primitive. Beliefs and knowledge and decisions can come out of your intuitions. You can build them from intuitions, but intuitions are just that very first little spark of a belief that you get before your brain has a really good chance to digest it and turn it into a belief that you can express and explain and talk to other people with. I'm concerned with those feelings. And a lot of other moral epistemologists are too. To make a long story short, this is a major problem in moral epistemology because centuries of study have basically led us all to the conclusion that without moral intuitions, we can't get our moral epistemology off the ground. We can't justify more complex moral beliefs and decisions. We need those intuitions to even work on ethics. They are the basic spark that allow us to fan the flames of morality as an understanding, as an intellectual enterprise, and grow our set of moral propositions. And this is a problem because we all want to be able to do ethics. We want to be able to talk about morality in a responsible and rational way. And we need intuitions for that. They are the building blocks of moral epistemology. And yet, our moral intuitions are wrong all the time. Every one of us has had, currently has, and will have in the future, dozens, hundreds, countless moral intuitions, many every day. And some will be right, and some will be wrong. And we don't have really great ways of telling one from another. Or at least, we don't obviously have any great ways. And that's really where my work focuses. And so I want to distill to you a few of my conclusions on how we can actually approach our moral intuitions, some questions we can ask ourselves to improve the status of our moral intuitions and thus be more confident in our moral beliefs and in the codes we follow and in our actions, ultimately. And I should say, going into this, do not mistake any of this for a pass-fail, yes-no, simple answer. Anyone who is giving you simple answers to moral questions is almost certainly wrong. Morality is complex. Moral philosophy, even more so. All of this is complex, but these are ways that you can help think critically when making moral decisions and coming to moral conclusions based on those intuitions. So the first question is this, and these build on each other as we go. So, is my intuition unjustifiably vague or imprecise? At the end of the day, this means, do I understand what my intuition means? If I have this feeling, if I encounter something in the world and I get an ick to it, a moral kind of ick, or I get a feeling that maybe I could get behind that or something, do I understand the implications of that? A lot of the time we get these intuitions and they're just too vague to do anything with. You can't really build a moral code out of them. You might not even be able to build a single moral belief out of them in any kind of reliable way. And if you can't understand your intuitions, they're probably not worth basing much on, and you can probably ignore them. That being said, I include unjustifiably there for a good reason. Some intuitions have a certain amount of vagueness in them and are worthwhile, not just in spite of it, but because of that. My favorite example of this is the notion of justice. I want to take a few seconds now and come up in your head with the very best definition of justice that you can. And if you're anything like me and every other human over the last 3,000 years or so, you really couldn't do that. It's an extremely difficult concept, extremely complex, extremely nuanced. People have been trying to define justice in a good way since the very beginning of written history. They're powerful intuitions, they're worthwhile, and the complexity of justice is the kind of thing that's going to allow us to think critically about it and be more confident in the conclusions that we end up coming to about justice. Now, the next question, again, building on from that, is why do I have this intuition? Where did it come from? Now, there's no use pretending that any of us aren't social beings, all right, who exist in the world and are formed by our experiences, and intuitions are the same way. Intuitions do not come from some pure, pristine, platonic heaven, some place separated from the world. They are caused by our experiences, our parents, our peers, our colleagues, our friends and enemies and heroes and idols, the movies we watch, the music we listen to, the books we read. Every experience we have growing up helps shape us, and part of that shaping is shaping our moral intuitions. And pretending like that's not the case is not going to get us anywhere. So we should acknowledge that our intuitions are caused, as are many other things, basically everything about us. They're caused by social forces and cultural forces, and we should recognize what those are. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, right? There are experiences that you have that you can be proud of. There are positive ones. We call them character-building experiences. And if your intuition is caused, if you have a moral intuition that you recognize as being caused by a character-building experience, something positive, well, that's a good reason to trust that intuition more than you otherwise might. At the same time, some of our intuitions come from less positive places. Maybe come from old-fashioned, intolerant, maybe bigoted notions of archaic views, tribalism, things that are also part of human history and culture. And if you recognize that's the cause of your intuition, well, then you have that much more reason to reject it. The third question, is my intuition consistent, and is it dogmatic? Now you can think of the consistency or coherence on one end, dogmatism on the other. These are extreme ends of a spectrum. What I mean by consistency is, does my intuition fit with my other beliefs in some kind of way that makes sense? Right? You can't do very much with intuitions if none of them agree with each other, and it's impossible to form a moral code or guide moral action out of them. So you need a certain amount of consistency to guide your action. At the other end, dogmatism, by that I just mean intuitions which are trusted or beliefs which are trusted only because they accord with other beliefs that you already have. If you are trusting in an intuition only because it fits with everything you already believe, that's not a real justification. That is not an intuition which can stand on its own merits, and so there's no reason to trust it for that reason. What you ought to be aiming for is rather a balance, trying to strike a balance between the extremes of inconsistency and dogmatism, right? You don't want your intuitions to be so incoherent that you can't build anything out of them, and you don't want them to be justified only because they already agree with everything you already believe. And finally, who do my intuitions overlook? Whose voices are not being heard? This, I think, has both a broad and a rather narrow implication. In a broad sense, we should always be trying to expand the scope of our moral experiences and intuitions. The more intuition, the more what you might call the raw data of morality that you get that helps you make those decisions, the better off and more reliable and more trustworthy your intuitions and your decisions will be. And then in a more narrow sense, I think we should all be very suspicious of any intuitions we have, and we all have them, of the nature that that person's crazy, those people aren't worth listening to, that's nonsense, I don't have to pay attention to that. We have these intuitions. We hear someone talking and we are dismissing. We hear some opinion coming from some quarter that we don't agree with, and we don't even listen. Those intuitions are always suspect because they're not strictly rational, and it's hard to build something rational out of them. Over time, you might actually get reasons to not listen to certain types of opinions, to reject them over a long, rational period. But an intuition, as a knee-jerk reaction, which tells you, don't listen to so-and-so or ignore that, should be highly suspect, and you should be very critical. Now, that being said, I don't expect everyone, I don't even myself subject my moral intuitions to this rigorous test all the time, and I don't expect anyone else to be able to either. So instead, I think there's a comfortable takeaway, a summary, a way of approaching this way of thinking about our moral intuitions that can help us rely on them more and is a little bit more straightforward. And it's based on two values that I think are sort of two sides of the same coin. The values are humility and pluralism. I think we should always approach our intuitions, particularly new intuitions, in the spirit of humility and pluralism. By humility, I simply mean recognizing that you can be wrong and that other people who disagree with you can be right. It doesn't mean accepting that you're always wrong or that you're never right or any such thing. All of us are right sometimes and wrong sometimes. If you acknowledge that, then your moral intuitions, your set of intuitions, will be that much more reliable because you are aware of its possible flaws. Pluralism just means, again, it's the other side of the same coin. It means actively accepting positions which disagree with yours, right? Accepting that people are going to have intuitions which are not the same as yours and which may actually contradict the ones that you have, and that those intuitions are nonetheless worthwhile and valuable, right? And the great thing is if we approach our intuitions in the spirit of humility and pluralism, you don't just get to, in a sense, purify your set of intuitions, right? That's one advantage. You get better at telling which of your intuitions are worth paying attention to and which aren't. Again, none of this is absolute. This is an ongoing project for everyone and for the very project of moral philosophy. But we get better this way. If we can eliminate more incorrect intuitions that can lead us to harmful or negative moral beliefs, incorrect ones at the end of the day. So not just there's that advantage, but there's something maybe even more powerful, which is that if you have an intuition which you subject in the spirit of humility and pluralism to every possible intuition, to other views, other beliefs, to other arguments, as often as you can, and every time you put that intuition up against an honest, critical test, as well as you can, in the spirit of humility and pluralism, and every time that intuition remains standing, then every time you have better and better reason to trust your moral intuition. Thank you.